Coming up on Extraordinary Faith, we take a day trip out of Manhattan and drive out to Norwalk, Connecticut, where we visit a parish that has become a regional magnet with its restored traditional architecture, liturgy, and music program. We meet an architect who organizes special events for those interested in traditional Catholic art. A priest-author explains to us a liturgical concept that he has helped to popularize. A professor from Texas tells us about some beautiful customs hidden in the church calendar. And we pay a visit to a church in Brooklyn that has undergone a remarkable transformation. Stay with us as we burrow around the boroughs of Catholic New York City, here on Extraordinary Faith. Hello, I'm Alex Began. Welcome to Extraordinary Faith, a program that travels far and wide to uncover places that are embracing the Church's traditions. This is the second of several episodes we're bringing you from New York City. We'll check out a church in Brooklyn that has undergone a dramatic architectural transformation. We'll drive up to Norwalk, Connecticut, and pay a visit to an amazing church that's kicked its parish life up a notch by capitalizing on the Church's traditions. Our first guest is an architect who's seeking to rejuvenate interest in traditional Catholic art. A city as diverse as New York is sure to have special interest groups of all sorts. We were intrigued by one that we discovered, the Catholic Artists Society. Dino Marcantonio is the president of the group. Dino, you're an architect by profession?
I am indeed. Specialize in high-end residential, but we also do some church work and various other kinds of projects.
And I've also known you as someone who's devoted to the traditional Latin Mass.
That is correct. So I was first awestruck by the traditional Latin Mass over 25 years ago now, and I continue to be awestruck.
Good for you. So tell us, what is the purpose of the Catholic Artists Society?
So there are essentially three goals that we have, the fraternal, the intellectual, and the spiritual. So first and foremost, we have the spiritual goal of increasing in sanctity. We believe that the spiritual life is the source from which all true artistry is born, and that we have a vocation that has been given to us that we have responded to, and in order to respond to it properly and fully and in a way that allows us to flourish as artists, we need to have a spiritual life. So we try to focus on that. Then our intellectual goals are essentially trying to deepen our understanding of how the Catholic faith informs what we do. So we're seeking understanding. There are certain facts that artists have to grapple with, artists of all stripes, and they are sure to have implications in the things that we do. And so we engage in discussions and study so that we can better ourselves on that level. And then finally, the fraternal goals. We like to meet other people who are like-minded. There are many artists who I think are looking for some kind of a fraternity, and certainly when they meet other people who are like-minded, they increase in confidence in both in their faith and in the application of their faith as they work on their vocations.
Does one have to be an artist to join or participate in the Society's activities?
No, one doesn't. In fact, paradoxically, most of our members, most of the people who attend the events are not artists. We certainly do have a lot of artists. We have actors, painters, architects, all kinds of people. But many people who come to our events are interested in art, and they're just interested in supporting the artistic community, in particular the Catholic artistic community.
What can we do to encourage the development of the sort of authentically Catholic artists who are responsible for designing and decorating the great churches that were built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries?
Well, I think first of all, we need to work on catechesis and also how catechesis relates specifically to the world of art. So this is essentially what we're trying to do. So there's two fronts that where we have to operate. You need to have a deep spiritual life. We certainly always need to work on that so that the artist has something to put into his work that can be drawn out by the audience. But one also has to have an understanding of how the Catholic faith informs what the artist is doing. We are interested not so much in how the modern world can inform the Catholic artist, rather we are interested in how Catholicism can inform the artist in the modern world.
One of the most talked about church restorations of the last decade has been at Holy Name of Jesus Church in Brooklyn. We decided to stop by and take a look for ourselves. Father Larry Ryan is the administrator of Holy Name. Father Larry, how did this project come about?
Well, this church was built in 1878, and it had a very traditional design, certainly a pre-Vatican II design, and remained that way through the early part of the 20th century, right up until about 1970. And then there was a really extensive renovation done that gave the church, the interior of the church, a very post-Vatican II or immediate post-Vatican II look. There were 12, we call them hockey sticks, installed in the sanctuary, large structures representing the seven sacraments. It never set that well with the parishioners or with the clergy that were assigned here or that lived here and were assigned here. And time went on, and there was always talk of change, but finally in about 2010, my predecessor here, Father Jim Cunningham, really undertook the project, and with the permission of the bishop, plans were made and funds were raised for an extensive renovation. Catalyst for the renovation really was the availability of that altar, the Renwick altar. It had been in a church in downtown Brooklyn, St. Vincent de Paul, a church that was closing during the 2000s, and it had actually been dismantled, carefully dismantled, into several pieces that had been carefully stored. The architect, James Renwick, was one of the leading church architects of the 19th century, one of the leading architects of the 19th century. He had designed St. Patrick's Cathedral over in Manhattan, and he'd also been the architect for the castle of the Smithsonian Museum down in Washington, D.C. So it's a beautiful altar. It was available, but to have it installed here as the centerpiece of the restoration took extensive foundational work underneath, actually thereby increasing the cost of the renovation. The side altars also come from St. Vincent de Paul downtown. When the renovation was done, it had the Renwick altar, the high altar in the background, but it also retained, it was a new, more modern altar. And we actually certainly celebrate Mass in both forms here, the extraordinary form and the ordinary form. Ordinary form much more commonly, of course, but we do have the extraordinary form here. It's set at the high altar, and the more modern altar is kept bare, so actually the congregation is participating in the Mass sort of looking over the more modern altar towards the high altar. One of the things I hope you pay attention to are the windows. There's some very, very beautiful stained glass work in this church. It was there at the beginning, but it had suffered really just damage over 135 years of aging. So the stained glass windows had to be removed almost in individual pieces carefully and cleaned, and new framing had to be put in. It's aluminum, but it's made to look like wood, and certainly is more weather efficient than wood would be, particularly over the long haul.
What can you say to those parishes who might be contemplating a similar project to this?
Well, I could say first that it's not inexpensive. The cost of this renovation was between $2 and $3 million. But it is possible. It's possible to do a renovation that sort of incorporates the best of the old and the best of the new. And I would just sort of encourage a parish that was considering it to put out into the deep and have faith and go forward with it, trying to preserve or restore the best of the old with the best of the new.
The more you dig into the liturgical life of the church, the more you realize how much there is to learn. There are gems hidden in so many places, even in the church calendar. Dr. Michael Foley is a professor of patristics at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. Dr. Foley, you have written extensively on two aspects of the extraordinary form calendar, Ember and Rogation Days. What are Ember Days?
The Ember Days are 4 periods of prayer and fasting that fall on a Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, and that correspond to the 4 natural seasons.
And what are Rogation Days?
Rogation Days are 2 separate periods of prayer and petition. The first Rogation Day is on April 25th, the Feast of St. Mark, and there is also a second set of Rogation Days that are on the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday before Ascension Thursday.
And I've read that there are processions on some of these days?
There are for the Rogation Days. The word rogation comes from the Latin rogare, to ask for. They used to hold great processions that would go through the field and country and bless the land.
So were these forms of thanksgiving for something, the land's harvest?
Something like that, especially to petition for agricultural bounty. The Rogation Days took place in the spring, and they were used to ask for blessings on the crops, but then also to ask for safety from natural disasters.
How are these relevant to today's life where so many of us live in cities?
I would argue that because so many of us live in cities, they're more relevant than ever. In terms of the Rogation Days, we need reminders of the agricultural cycles upon which all of us depend. You know, we live in an age that has a sort of back to the earth mentality, and there's a lot of good to that, but it can also be mixed in with a kind of neo-pagan worship of earth as mother goddess. The Rogation Days give you a really good Christian Catholic way to appreciate the agricultural cycles.
Now, these occur on weekdays. What is the case in a parish where it's not possible to hold a procession on a weekday?
Well, if a procession isn't possible, and there could be a number of reasons for that, Mass can still be celebrated. There are special Rogation Masses in the Missal for the 1962 Roman Rite.
Are there any other hidden features of the extraordinary form calendar that you'd like to point out to our viewers?
In some respects, most of the calendar has hidden features in the sense of a mystery. And the great beauty of the old rite is that the more you scratch it, the more mystery you find, the more interesting details from history and theology you see.
While we were in New York, we decided to take a drive up to Norwalk, Connecticut and visit St. Mary's Church, a parish that's had an interesting transformation towards tradition over the last decade. David Hughes is the director of music at St. Mary's and is going to show us around. David, one thing we've noticed is there's no freestanding altar in here.
That's correct. When the parish first began to think about the renovation, there was a freestanding altar that was just about where I'm standing right now. In working with Duncan Stroik, we figured out a way to take the freestanding altar and put it back as a side altar. In fact, the side altar had been chopped up into a pulpit, and thanks be to God, they used all the pieces of the altar in constructing the pulpit, so that we, as it were, could put Humpty Dumpty back together again and reconstruct the side altar as it had been. At the time that we were doing the repainting of the sanctuary, it became necessary to close the upper church for a few months and to have all the masses downstairs in the lower chapel. And the space in the sanctuary in the lower chapel is quite restricted. So in order to have the traditional Mass and the English and Spanish Mass facing east, as had been our custom, the altar would have to be pushed a foot or two this way. But then in order to have the other Masses during the week that were said facing the congregation, it'd have to be pulled out again this way. And because of the Mass schedule at the parish, this was a lot of pushing and pulling of the altar. So after a week of this, the pastor, Father Markey, announced to the congregation that for the duration of our time downstairs in the chapel, that all the masses would be said facing east as a practical matter. You know, it just was a lot less cumbersome to push and pull the altar, and he did an excellent job of catechesis, explaining why it is the church has traditionally faced east in her prayers. And a thing that was very interesting to us, the clergy and the staff of the parish, is that we, I think, thought this would be met with some degree of resistance, because it's, you know, in our minds, it's perhaps the single greatest change in posture and in architecture, and possibly the single most important one for recovering the traditions of the church. And at the masses where, even if we sang a sanctus, you know, the simple sanctus in Latin during Advent, you know, would be met with you know, few little complaints here and there. Not a single person complained. Not a single person complained when we had all the masses facing east, which was so interesting to us, because to us to have prayers in Latin wasn't so big a deal, but the posture was a huge deal. And in point of fact, for the perception of the congregation, it was the other way around.
How much of what we're looking at here is new in the renovation versus original to the church?
The floor that we're standing on is brand new. It's Carrara marble that was chosen to match the high altar. The only things in the sanctuary that are original to the church are the high altar and the two side altars, which have been put back into place. There used to be a reredos on top of the high altar, and that was chopped off in the mid-60s. So everything else that we see has been designed anew. The altar rails are from a church that had been closed. The same is true of the pulpit, also from a closed church, I think chosen brilliantly to match what's already here. The altarpiece painted by Leonard Porter and the frame for it designed by Duncan Strike are new, and the paint job of the church is completely new as well.
Then above us, I see something you don't normally see in many Catholic churches. What is that?
So above us and directly above the communion rail is the rood beam, and that was also part of the renovation. And the rood is an Old English word for cross, so it's always a sculptural group of Our Lord on the cross and Our Lady and St. John. The sculpting of the statuary group was done by a parishioner, Peter Kelly, and as an act of devotion, an act of love, he carved them himself.
David, you and I first met a few years ago at one of the CMAA music conferences.
That's right.
Your role here is music, so tell us about the music life here.
At St. Mary's, we're blessed to have a choral program that comprises about 6 choirs or so. On a Sunday morning, there's the professional Schola Cantorum that sings for the traditional Mass, and we consider it very important that we have solemn Mass with priest, deacon, and subdeacon 52 Sundays a year, which means we also have the Schola 52 Sundays a year. And the people that I'm privileged to work with in the Schola are outstanding musicians and colleagues and friends who bring a real love of this treasury of music going back to 12th century France and continuing up to the present day. There are a number of people who have been attracted to the parish by the music at the 9:30 Mass, and frequently they'll come upstairs and say, you know, this is really beautiful. I want to learn to do this myself. And I consider it very, very important that the foundation of their musical education is Gregorian chant. Chant is, of course, the foundation of all Western music, and without any doubt the foundation of all Catholic music. But I think beyond that, it should be the pedagogical foundation, because you can't possibly sing a piece of polyphony beautifully where you have several different lines occurring at the same time, the sopranos or the altos or the tenors, so forth. It's not possible to sing that beautifully unless you can first sing a chant where we all sing the same thing at the same time, beautifully and with understanding.
Thank you, David. We're impressed with all the organization that must go into all your efforts here. Now let's listen in on a performance of the Students' Schola, who sang at a solemn Mass for the Sacra Liturgia conference last night. Almost every industry or special interest group has a lingo all its own. If you've read up on the Church's liturgy, you're likely to have run across the expression, the reform of the reform. Father Thomas Kocik is a priest of the Diocese of Fall River, Massachusetts, and has written a book on the subject. Father Kocik, what is the reform and why do some want to reform it?
The reform in question refers to the reform of the liturgy of the Roman Rite of the Catholic Church that followed the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. That liturgical reform, which altered Roman Catholic worship considerably, according to some critics, far exceeded what the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council intended with regard to liturgical renewal. So since the 1980s or 1990s in particular, there has been talk not only among the laity, but in ecclesiastical circles about reforming the reform, meaning to correct certain deficiencies or problems with the post-Vatican II liturgical reform to bring Catholic liturgical life closer to what the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council had intended. In other words, to connect more closely with a tradition and with many riches of our tradition that were abandoned unwarrantedly after Vatican II.
Are we talking about the music, the language, the arts?
Both. The Second Vatican Council authorized the use of the modern languages of the people, the vernacular languages in the liturgy, in particular with regard to the readings that are used at Mass. But the Second Vatican Council never called for a total elimination of the Latin language in the Church's worship. So in that regard, we're talking about language. We're talking also about music, the music that we hear at Mass and in other liturgical celebrations. The Second Vatican Council allowed the use of local hymnody, for example, but it never called for the abolition of Gregorian chant and plain chant and sacred polyphony, which for centuries have marked Roman Catholic worship.
So how is this different from advocating a return to the pre-Vatican II liturgy?
So we're not talking wholesale restoration of the liturgy as it stood prior to and during the Second Vatican Council. So we're not talking about, or the advocates of a reform of the reform do not seek an elimination altogether of the use of the vernacular languages. There's a place in the liturgy for the vernacular, but that does not mean Latin is to be thrown out the window. Likewise, modern hymns, the language that is music particular to local peoples, local cultures, there's room for that, but Gregorian chant is the music that is proper to the Roman Rite of the Catholic Church, and that has great value in evoking a sense of the transcendent and mystery, and the universality of the Church, not only across space, but across time as well. It's timeless. It evokes a sense of eternity. There's a place for that. The music is supposed to be different from what you would hear ordinarily on the radio. It's supposed to transport us out of this world and give us a glimpse of eternity and the beauty of God. So it's not a blind restoration in that sense. Let's scrap everything that happened after the council, but let's recover lost treasures. There's room for the old and the new, and this is what the reform of the reform advocates are about, and that's what differentiates them from hardline traditionalists who would scrap everything that occurred in the liturgy following the Second Vatican Council, as if it were all bad.
Is there room for both approaches, to have the reform of the reform as well as the extraordinary form in a parish?
Indeed, of course. The reform of the reform makes no sense. It's unintelligible apart from the traditional liturgy, because that has to be the benchmark. That is the tradition which the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council sought to revise or modify modestly. But if we don't have that as the basis for reforming the reform, well, where do we recover these treasures from? You know? The Catholic Church has always admitted a diversity of liturgical rites. The Mass, as most Catholics know it and worship according to it, is the Roman Rite or the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church, but there are also many Eastern rites, the Byzantine, the Coptic, the Armenian, the Chaldean. These belong to the Eastern Catholic churches. So there's always been diversity of worship within the Catholic Church itself.
How would you respond to those who would say that having diversity of worship might actually be divisive?
It has not proven to be divisive in the history of the Church. There have always been Eastern rites in addition to the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church. And even in the Western Church itself, there have been local usages. For example, in Milan and in Toledo, Spain, these are variants of the Roman liturgy that have been celebrated for centuries, and has not proven to be divisive to the Catholic community with the Ambrosian Rite. The Catholic Church is a many-splendored thing, and it's a big tent. As long as these liturgical rites reflect adequately what we believe as Catholics. There's an old maxim, an adage that says the law of prayer is the law of belief. Lex orandi, lex credendi. We worship according to what we believe, and what we believe is shaped by our worship, and what we believe shapes our worship. There's a reciprocal relationship between faith and worship.
On our next episode, travel with us to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we'll be attending the Sacred Music Colloquium of the Church Music Association of America. Over 200 people from across the globe come to this conference every year to learn how to sing Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony. We'll discover the history and objectives of the colloquium from its organizer. We'll hear the success story of a parish in San Diego that offers a popular summer camp that trains children how to sing chant. We'll learn about the only fully extraordinary form parish in America that is led by a diocesan priest. And we'll hear how a basilica in Chattanooga is revitalizing its sacred music program by embracing the church's classical repertoire. There's more information about every person and place we visit on our website, extraordinaryfaith.tv. We also invite you to like us on Facebook, where we post the latest updates about our program and respond to your questions and comments. Thanks for joining us in New York, and come back with us next time as we continue to explore the beauties of Catholic tradition here on Extraordinary Faith.